Testing is an important part of writing code. It allows you to possibly find bugs, but more importantly, it is a way to check to make sure code does not break when extending functionality. Luckily, testing in Rust is super easy. So in this section, we're going to check out how it is done. I started off with creating a new library directory. And like all of my other examples, let's keep this simple and just see the important aspects of what we are working on. So let's start off with the default example that Rust gives us. And let's break it down really quickly. So at the very top, we see we have CFG test. CFG stands for configuration and tells Rust to only include the following when given a certain configuration option. So we are essentially configuring the following only for when we want to run test. Then we create a test module and we add this bit right here. And what this is going to do is it's basically going to tell the Rust compiler, hey, the following function is a test. And I'll show what happens when we forget that little bit right there. And then inside of that we have the test function. And we have many options that we can choose from, and we can see in the default example it has the assert equals macro. And this is going to make sure that the left hand side is going to equal the right hand side. So to run this, we simply run cargo test, and we can see that it outputs running one test, and it is testing it works, which is the name of our function, and in this case it passed, so it outputs OK to us, and it lets us know that we had one that passed. So what happens if we take this little portion out that I mentioned earlier, and now we try to run it? Well, it says it's running 0 tests, right? So now the Rust compiler doesn't know that this is a test. So that's why that little bit is important to include above the function. So we can see that everything worked. So let's add another function and make it a failing one just to see what that looks like. And we can do this by using the panic keyword. So remember, we got to include test, and then we're going to say function it fails. And now we're going to just say panic test failed. And now if we run this, running cargo test, we now see what a failing test looks like. So again, it's going to tell us what function was ran. In this case, it fails, and it failed. Which is great, because that's what we wanted to see. We just wanted to see what a failing test looks like. And we can use panic to induce a failing test in this situation. So that's just a very broad overview of testing. So let's get into a little bit more examples using assertions in the next lecture. So we know that we have a lot of different assertions that we can use to logically evaluate if something is true or not. So we see up here that we have assert equals result and 4. So we're basically checking to make sure that the result variable here, which contains the value of 2 plus 2 equals 4, which we know is true. But if we change this to 5 and then run testing again, we see that they both fail. So again, assert equals is just saying, hey, I want to make sure the left hand side equals the right hand side. So let's change this back to where it will be successful. And now we have another assert macro, and that is useful when we want to make sure that some condition evaluates to true. So what we'll do here is we'll come out of the module and we'll create another function called simple add. That's going to return a Boolean, and we'll say if 2 plus 2 equals 4, return true, else false. So we know that this is going to return true. So we'll come up here and we'll say function call simple add, and then we will just say assert simple add. And now we see that it says cannot find function simple add in this scope, because remember, we're outside of our module. So in order for this function to be available to us, we need to include use super and then everything on the outside. And super is basically saying, hey, come out of these brackets and I want what's available out here as well. So now if we run this, we'll be able, and I need to include test here. And now you can see that's going to say run test. And we don't want this it fails to run anymore. So another trait that we can add here is ignore. And this is going to allow us to just ignore running this test. That way we don't have any failures. So now if we run cargo test, we see that, one, it fails was ignored after we added this ignore attribute. And then we said call simple add, which we had simple add here, and then our test was called simple add. And in this case, it evaluated to true because our function down here evaluated to true. So the difference between assert equals and assert is we can logically evaluate one item here, whereas up here you're trying to evaluate that the left and the right are equal. So it's just a little bit more flexibility in that regard. And then one other test that we can have is assert not equals. And what we can do up here is say not equals, and then we want it to now be 5, right? So this is going to be us testing, hey, we know that these two are not going to be equal, so we want to make sure that they're not equal. Because, you know, result for whatever reason did equal 5 when we know that it's 2 plus 2, well then we have a really big issue. So in this case, we're going to evaluate that it's being evaluated correctly, which it was. So we also have assert not equals. And then sometimes we want to make sure that tests panic. So we're going to get rid of this ignore attribute and we're going to put should panic. So now we are expecting this test to panic. So when we expect it to panic and it does panic, now we have an okay. And sometimes you want to make sure that certain situations a panic is caught or an error of some sort is caught, because it's good to make sure that your error handling is correct too in certain situations. So we have many ways to write tests and logically map out how we want our test to be executed. And by default, the tests are ran in parallel to speed up the testing. But if you have, additional threads available to you, then you can write cargo test and then tac and then tac again, test threads, and then you can set it to your number of threads. So we'll set it to 1 here, and then we can set it to 4 here. We don't have many tests, and they're also not very expensive tests, so checking out how the time difference in this case isn't viable. But also sometimes you might not want to run all your tests, because if you get a really large program, you could have hundreds, if not thousands of tests, and running them all the time just to check the functionality of one component just might not be a viable option for you. So what we can do is we can run a subset of tests, or we can just say, hey, I want you to only run this one test. So we can say cargo test call simple add. So this is going to be the name of our test function, and when we run it, we see that the only test function that ran was the one that we explicitly called. Well, in the event that we want to run a subset of tests, then we can run cargo test it. And so we have the it word in it fails and in it works. And now that we can see that down here we ran it works and we ran it fails. So that's how we can run a subset of tests. And that's really all there is to it, to testing. So in the next section, we're going to build out our first command line interface program that's going to do a find and replace on a file.